They saw the gray in her hair before they saw the steel in her spine. It was a common mistake. In the harsh, unforgiving light of the forward operating base carved into the arid mountains, Chief Warrant Officer Alara was a study in quiet obsolescence. Her movements were economical, her face a roadmap of seasons spent under relentless suns, and her voice, when she used it, was as soft as the dust that settled on everything. She was the keeper of the base's single, most profound joke, an ancient AC-47 gunship, a lumbering beast of a bygone era that sat at the far end of the airfield like a forgotten monument. The younger crews called it the matriarch, a name delivered with a smirk, a term of mocking endearment for a machine, and a woman they both considered past their prime. Colonel Vance, new to the command and brimming with the clean, sharp energy of a man who trusted technology over instinct, saw her as a piece of an inefficient puzzle he was determined to solve. He'd walked through her hangar once, his boots echoing in the cavernous space. He'd run a gloved hand over the gunship's scarred aluminum skin, leaving a clean streak in the fine layer of dust. "Keep your focus on the Black Hawks, Chief," he'd said, not unkindly but with the unmistakable finality of a superior officer. "That's where the fight is now. We need transport, not history." He hadn't waited for a reply. The most vocal of the scoffers was Lieutenant Hayes, a pilot whose swagger was as polished as his aviator sunglasses. He flew the Apaches, sleek, predatory machines that were all composite materials and whispering lethality. He saw Alara's patient, meticulous work on the matriarch's radio engines as a quaint hobby, like a grandmother tending a garden that would never bloom. "Still trying to wake the dead, Chief?" He'd call out as he strode past, his flight suit crisp, his youth a weapon in itself. "Don't you know the museum is closed?" Alara never rose to the bait. Her response was silence, a stillness that absorbed the insults and rendered them inert. She simply continued her work, her hands, stained with grease and hydraulic fluid, moving with a surgeon's precision. She knew the gunship not as a collection of parts, but as a living entity. She felt the subtle shifts in its balance, the unique tremor of its oil lines, the deep, resonant hum of its soul. In the quiet of the hangar, with the desert wind moaning outside, she was not a mechanic. She was a confessor, listening to the secrets of an old warrior. The scent of oil and ozone was a balm to her, more comforting than any perfume. As she worked, the sleeve of her fatigues would sometimes ride up her arm, revealing a glimpse of a tattoo on the inside of her wrist. It was a single, stylized raven's wing, faded to a soft gray-blue, almost invisible against her skin. It was a ghost of a symbol, or a ghost of a unit, from a life no one here could possibly imagine. Her silence wasn't emptiness. It was a fortress built of memories too heavy to share. The plan was textbook arrogance. A critical supply convoy, laden with munitions and medical supplies for the remote outpost, had to traverse a valley infamous on every strategic map. They called it the Serpent's Gulch, a winding, high-walled canyon that offered 1,000 perfect places for an ambush. High Command, buoyed by a string of recent successes, deemed the risk acceptable. Their confidence rested on a pair of Apache attack helicopters, the very machines Lieutenant Hayes flew with such bravado. They were the silver bullets, the technological guarantors of safety. Then the world turned orange. A shamal, a sudden and violent sandstorm, boiled up from the south with terrifying speed. It was not a mere storm. It was a wall, a moving mountain of grit and wind that swallowed the sky. Within minutes, visibility dropped to near zero. The air became a rasping, scouring entity. On the airfield, the delicate, high-performance turbines of the Apaches were immediately shut down and covered. Their sophisticated sensor arrays and fly-by-wire systems were exquisitely vulnerable to the abrasive assault of the sand. They were grounded, useless, polished, expensive statues. The convoy, however, was already deep inside the Serpent's Gulch. The first transmission was frantic, garbled by the storm's electromagnetic interference. "Contact! Contact! Ambush! We're pinned down from the high ground!" The voice was young, terrified. The next burst of static-laced screaming confirmed the worst. It wasn't a small raiding party. It was a coordinated, overwhelming attack. The staccato bark of heavy machine guns and the deafening crump of mortar fire echoed faintly over the comms, ghosts of a battle being lost. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded the command tent. Colonel Vance stood before the digital map, his face a grim mask. The green icons representing the convoy were clustered together, unmoving, surrounded by a rapidly growing rash of red markers. An entire enemy battalion, hidden and waiting, had sprung the trap perfectly. Lieutenant Hayes stood beside him, his helmet in his hands, his swagger gone, replaced by a pale, impotent fury. He was a bird of prey with clipped wings, forced to listen to the sounds of the flock being devoured. "Get me air support, I don't care how." Vance barked into his headset, but he knew the answer. The storm was absolute. The pilots shook their heads. The maintenance chiefs confirmed it. Nothing modern could fly in this. The calls from the gulch grew more desperate, the intervals between them longer. They were taking heavy casualties. They were being systematically dismantled. The battle was turning into a massacre, and the command staff could do nothing but listen to it happen. Into this maelstrom of failing technology and rising despair, Alara walked. She moved without haste, the dust of the storm clinging to her shoulders like a shroud. She had just finished her pre-flight checks on the matriarch, a ritual she performed daily, storm or no storm. The air in the command tent was thick enough to taste a compound of sweat, fear, and stale coffee. Vance didn't even look at her, his eyes glued to the flickering map. "What is it, Chief?" He snapped, his voice frayed. "If it's not about getting a helicopter in the air, I don't have time for it." Alara's voice, when it came, was unnervingly calm, cutting through the tension like a blade. "The matriarch can fly in this." For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind whipping against the tent canvas and the crackle of the radio. Then a choked laugh came from Lieutenant Hayes. "Are you insane? That relic? The sand will strip the cylinders bare. Its navigation systems couldn't find this tent, let alone a valley in this storm." The other officers shifted, their expressions a mixture of pity and annoyance. Alara didn't look at Hayes. Her gaze was fixed on Colonel Vance. "The engines are piston-driven, Colonel. They're shielded. They can digest sand that would kill a turbine. The navigation is analog. Magnetic compass, directional gyro. They don't get scrambled. The machine knows the way, and so do I." Her words were simple, declarative sentences. There was no pleading in them, no hint of doubt. She was stating a series of facts, as if reading a technical manual. It was the sheer, unadorned certainty in her tone that made Vance finally turn and look at her. He saw the gray hair, the lined face, but for the first time, he saw something else behind her eyes. A depth, a stillness that wasn't passive but coiled, like a spring under immense pressure. He looked at the map, where another friendly icon had just blinked out. He looked at the faces of his hotshot pilots, their confidence shattered. He had no other cards to play. His decision was a gasp of desperation. "Fine," he said, the word clipped. "Get it in the air. But you are observation only, do you understand, Chief? Give us eyes on the enemy positions. That's it. You are not to engage." He then turned to Hayes. "You'll go with her, co-pilot. You know the modern fire control comms." He was still hedging his bets, trying to inject some of his world into hers, unable to fully cede control. Alara's response was immediate and absolute. "I fly alone." It was not a request. It was a condition. The words hung in the air, an unbreakable declaration. Hayes started to protest. His pride stung. "Sir, she can't possibly—" "Quiet, Lieutenant," Vance commanded, his eyes locked on Alara. That strange, unsettling certainty was still there, an immovable object. He didn't understand it, but in the calculus of desperation, it was the only variable that felt solid. He gave a sharp, frustrated nod. "Just get in the air. Now." The hangar doors groaned open, fighting against the force of the wind. The matriarch stood waiting, impassive. Alara moved with a speed and purpose that belied her years. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. She was a whirlwind of focused energy, her hands flying over fuel lines, control surfaces, and ammunition feeds. Strapping herself into the pilot's seat was a homecoming. The worn leather embraced her. The cockpit, with its constellation of steam gauges and heavy toggle switches, smelled of oil, old metal, and something else of memory, of countless hours spent between earth and sky. It felt right. It felt real. When she flicked the switches for the engines, they didn't whine to life. They coughed, sputtered, and then erupted with a deep, guttural roar that shook the very air in the hangar. It was a sound of raw, mechanical power, a furious, visceral protest against the storm. The ground crew, huddled by the door, stared in disbelief. The sound wasn't just loud, it was primal. It was the roar of a beast waking from a long slumber. Alara pushed the throttles forward, and the old gunship lumbered onto the runway. It didn't slice through the storm, it bludgeoned its way into it. The wind hammered at the fuselage, the sand scouring the thick cockpit glass with a sound like a million tiny claws. The aircraft bucked and shuddered, a titan wrestling with the sky. But Ilara's hands on the yoke were steady, her touch light but firm. She wasn't fighting the storm. She was using it, feeling its currents, riding its fury, making the chaos her partner. She merged with the screaming wind, becoming just another element of its rage. Back in the command tent, a grainy, black and white video feed flickered to life. It showed nothing but a swirling vortex of sand, a hypnotic, terrifying blur. The link was analog, a low-frequency signal robust enough to pierce the storm's interference where modern digital streams failed. For a moment, there was only that image and the roar of the wind over the comms. Then Alara's voice came through, as calm and clear as a bell. Entering the pass at grid 097, holding altitude at 1,000 feet, she was calling out coordinates, navigating by a map seared into her memory. She broke through into the relative calm of the valley, and the scene below was a vision from hell. The convoy's burning trucks formed a makeshift, broken circle. Muzzle flashes winked from the canyon walls on all sides, a storm of fire pouring down on the trapped soldiers. It was a perfect kill box. The sheer number of enemy positions was staggering. Vance, watching the feed, which now showed glimpses of the carnage through the dust, felt his stomach clench. It was worse than he had imagined. An entire battalion, dug in and methodical. His voice was tight with strain as he spoke into his mic. "Report, Chief. Observation only. I repeat, observation only. Pinpoint the mortar positions for us." There was a pause. On the video feed, they could see her hand, steady and sure, move from the control yoke to a panel on her left. It was a panel of heavy, guarded switches, dark with age. She flipped one, then another, then a third. On the console, dim red lights. Lights that probably hadn't been lit since before Lieutenant Hayes was born, glowed with sudden, ominous life. Her voice returned, but it was different. The quiet deference of the maintenance chief was gone, stripped away. What remained was cold, hard, and resonant with an authority that chilled the air in the command tent. It was the voice of a predator that had just spotted its prey. "This is Nix," she said. "I am engaging." A profound, deathly silence fell over the command tent. Colonel Vance stared at the speaker as if it had cursed him. Hayes's jaw went slack. Nix. The name was a whisper, a myth from the shadowed corners of military lore. Standing near the back of the tent, a visiting two-star general, a man who had been observing the crisis with a grim passivity, took a sharp breath. His eyes, fixed on the screen, were wide with disbelief. He spoke the name in a hushed, reverent tone that barely carried across the room. "Nix? It can't be. She's a ghost." Then came the sound. It wasn't the clinical, high-pitched brrr of a modern Gatling gun. It was a deep, apocalyptic roar, the sound of fabric being torn on a cosmic scale. On the video feed, the world outside the cockpit lit up with a torrent of red tracers that poured from the side of the aircraft, not as a stream, but as a solid wall of light. The Matriarch's 3 134 miniguns, relics of a more brutal age, had opened up. What followed was not a battle. It was a symphony of precise, controlled destruction. Alara wasn't just flying the plane, she was dancing with it. She heaved a huge, lumbering airframe through turns that should have torn its wings off, using the canyon walls and the swirling curtains of sand as her personal stage. She would appear from a shroud of dust, unleash a devastating river of fire on a fortified position, and then slip back into the storm before the enemy could even process what was happening. She was a phantom, a roaring specter of vengeance. Her methodology was terrifyingly clinical. She didn't just spray and pray. She painted with fire, cutting down enemy positions with an artist's precision. Her voice, the voice of Nyx, became the only sound in the command tent, a calm, steady metronome of annihilation. Mortar platoon at Ridgeline Delta, neutralized. Shifting to heavy machine gun nest, quadrant gamma. There was no emotion, no triumph, just a flat, efficient report of a task being completed. Command and control element, east flank, eliminated. Enemy fire is suppressed. Down in the gulch, the beleaguered soldiers looked up. Through the hellstorm of sand and bullets, they saw it. A dark, winged shape. A plane from their grandfather's war stories, silhouetted against the raging sky, spitting a righteous fire that cut through the enemy ranks like a scythe. The pressure on them vanished almost instantly. The relentless rain of mortar shells ceased. The heavy guns fell silent. Hope, which had bled out into the sand, surged back into their veins. They rallied, their own fire, finding new purpose, pushing back against a now confused and terrified enemy. The enemy battalion had planned for everything except a ghost. They were prepared for modern Apaches, for ground troops, for a long siege. They were not prepared for a single ancient gunship to appear from the heart of an impossible storm, flown by a pilot who moved like a force of nature and killed with the detached precision of a god. They were being systematically dismembered by an unseen, unheard of power. Their command structure evaporated in seconds. Their heavy weapons were silenced. Panic shattered their discipline. They broke. In the command tent, the legend of Nyx was being whispered into reality by the old general. He spoke of Ghostwing, a black operations squadron that flew solo, unsupported missions deep behind enemy lines. They flew the oldest, most reliable aircraft, modified to be silent predators. They were officially a myth, a unit that never existed, their records sealed or destroyed. And their commander, the most feared and respected pilot of them all, was a woman known only by her call sign, Nyx, the goddess of the night. They said she could fly anything, anywhere, in any conditions. They said she retired, disappeared, a decade ago. Most assumed she was dead. Colonel Vance listened, his face pale. He looked at the screen, at the methodical destruction being wrought by the woman he had dismissed as a museum keeper. He looked at Lieutenant Hayes, whose youthful arrogance had been sandblasted away, leaving only raw, stunned awe. He had sent a mechanic on an observation run. A legend had answered the call to war. Just as the last pockets of enemy resistance crumbled into a full-scale rout, the Shamal began to recede. The wind lessened its furious assault, and shafts of weak, dust-filtered sunlight pierced the gloom. Below, the Serpent's Gulch was quiet except for the crackle of burning wreckage and the distant shouts of the rescued soldiers. High above, the matriarch, its green and brown camouflage pockmarked with fresh bullet holes, made one slow, deliberate circle over the convoy. It was a victor's pass, a guardian's final inspection. Then, its nose turned for home, its engines thrumming a steady, powerful rhythm. The landing was perfect. The old gunship touched down with a grace that defied its bulk and settled onto the tarmac, its engine sputtering into a final, sighing silence. The quiet that followed was profound, broken only by the fading whistle of the wind. A wave of humanity surged from the hangars and the command tent. Medics with stretchers, ground crew with fire extinguishers, officers with stunned expressions. They all ran toward the silent plane, expecting to find a hero, perhaps a wounded one, in the cockpit. The canopy hatch pushed open with a hydraulic hiss, and Alara emerged. She was untouched. A smear of grease adorned her right cheek like war paint. Her expression was calm, her eyes distant, as if returning from a place very far away. She swung herself out of the cockpit and onto the wing, her movements fluid and unhurried. Her first action was not to acknowledge the crowd, but to begin her post-flight check, her hands running over the leading edge of the wing, feeling for damage. Her duty was to the machine first, always. Colonel Vance was the first to reach her. He stopped a few feet away, flanked by Lieutenant Hayes and the rest of his command staff. The entire base, it seemed, had gathered on the tarmac, their figures forming a silent, solemn semicircle. There were no cheers, no shouts. The moment felt too sacred for that. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated reverence. Vance opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? Sorry for my arrogance? Thank you for defying my orders and saving my men? He looked at her, at this quiet, unassuming woman who had just single-handedly turned the tide of a battle everyone had considered lost. He looked at the brutalized but still proud aircraft she had piloted with such impossible skill. He finally found his voice, though it was rough with emotion. Chief Warrant Officer, Ilara, He trailed off, the inadequacy of his vocabulary a palpable thing. He settled for the only words that mattered. Thank you. Lieutenant Hayes stepped forward. His face, once a mask of smug superiority, was now stripped bare, showing only shame and a profound, humbling awe. He didn't try to speak. He simply brought his hand up in a slow, perfect salute. It wasn't the perfunctory gesture of a subordinate to a superior. It was the salute of a student to a master, of a believer to a miracle. One by one, every other uniformed soldier on that tarmac followed his lead. The air filled with the soft rustle of sleeves as 100 salutes were rendered in a silence more powerful than any ovation. Alara met their gazes for a brief moment. She saw their changed perceptions, the respect that had replaced their dismissiveness. She didn't need it. The validation she required came from the thrum of the engines, the solid feel of the controls in her hands, and the lives of the soldiers she had pulled from the fire. Her work had spoken for her. She offered a single, small, noted acknowledgement, not of their praise, but of the shared ordeal. Then, she turned her back on them and walked away, her boots leaving faint prints in the dust on the tarmac. She was heading back to the maintenance hangar, her mind already cataloging the repairs the matriarch would need. The bullet holes would have to be patched, the hydraulic lines checked for leaks, the engines pampered and thanked. As she walked, the last rays of the setting sun broke fully through the clouds, casting long shadows across the airfield. The light caught her wrist, illuminating for a fleeting second the faded, gray-blue tattoo of the raven's wing. It was the mark of the ghost, the sigil of the night, now returning to the quiet shadows where it belonged. The crowd of soldiers stood frozen, watching her go, their salutes held firm, their minds grappling with the fact that the quietest, most overlooked person on their base was the most dangerous, and that a living legend had been polishing engines in their midst all along.